So the aim is to explore how we identify or individuate implicatures, how we spot them. And the plan is going to be, first of all, to have a little bit, just one slide on the background about formal theories of meaning and the role of implicatures. Then I'm going to move on to some stuff which I take it will be massively familiar to everybody, what Grice had to tell us about implicatures. And I'll do that reasonably quickly, because I take it that it's very familiar. Then I'll talk about the problem of explicatures. We've heard a bit about explicatures already in Liz's talk, in Alison's talk, and in other places. So again, I'll do that pretty quickly. And then I'll move on to three possible options for individuating implicatures, looking to the formal features of the language, looking to the psychological features, and looking to the sociolinguistic features. I think I'll probably only talk about the positive view that I'm going to have, which is the sociolinguistic one. And I'm going to suggest that we should use these sociolinguistic features to individuate between implicatures and explicatures. And I'm going to then say some big picture stuff about what that tells us about the divide between semantics and pragmatics and how we should draw it. And if lots of people block their ears, I'll tell you a little bit about why I think that shows that we need these things I call minimal propositions. Okay, so the background then. I take it that we want a theory of meaning for a language to be compositional, to have the meanings of complex wholes determined by the meanings of the parts and the way that they're put together, in order to explain the stuff that we all know about, the stuff we know we need to explain, the language learning, the systematicity, and the productivity. So we want a theory of meaning to have this certain kind of feature, but as soon as we look to communicated content, it seems pretty clear that we lose that kind of compositionality, because the claim that we can predict communicated content on the basis of the meanings of the words and the way that they're put together is just patently false, right? We all know the examples here. It's a lovely day conveying it's a horrible day. Students can take logic or maths, meaning they could take logic or maths in one context, maybe both, but maybe not both in another context. Someone ate the last cookie, meaning Fred ate the last cookie or Jill ate the last cookie. We can't get to what's being communicated just on the basis of what words someone produces. So Grice really matters here, right? Grice really matters for formal semanticists because it looks like he might hold out the hope of being able to rescue the project of formal semantics, the giving of this kind of compositional, systematic, tractable theory of meaning, because he can show us how it is that that kind of tractable theory doesn't need to account for all of the kinds of contents that get communicated when we're talking to one another. So I reckon it's that reason that Soames, for instance, calls Grice's work on conversational implicatures one of the great achievements of the past 50 years. So I think we should definitely not undervalue how important Grice is in this field. So here's Grice's model. I take it that everybody knows it, and it's a very poor PowerPoint. I'm sure people could make better ones, but Grice is interested in the total signification of what is said, the complete content of a communicative act. He breaks that into two things: what is said by the sentence, and that's supposed to be some notion of directly communicated or explicit content. What is implicated by the speaker, on the other hand, is what the speaker indirectly conveys. This falls on what is said by the sentence side, but notice it looks kind of pragmatic-y. It's disambiguation and reference assignment. But the real weight of the pragmatics falls on the other side, the division between two different kinds of implicatures, and then the division of conversational implicatures into generalized cases like scalars and particularized cases like the reference writing case. So we all know Grice's model, and although Grice didn't tend to talk about semantics versus pragmatics, it's a pretty common assumption that the stuff on this side is supposed to fall on the semantic side, and the stuff on that side falls on the pragmatic side. Or at least that the notion of what is said by a sentence falls on the semantic side, and then we might argue whether that gets in there or not. So what did Grice tell us about implicatures then? What does he give us? Well, he gives us, I think, three important things when we're thinking about implicatures, the stuff on the far side of his table. First of all, and I think we shouldn't undervalue this either, he gives us a really vivid set of examples to illustrate the difference that he's interested in. Okay, some of them have not stood the test of time. Most people don't know what's implied by someone putting on a dinner jacket anymore. It's not really clear what that is. But lots of them are really evocative, right? We all know about the reference writer case, the petrol station case, All these ones really seem really clear examples of the phenomenon that we're targeting. And furthermore, he gives us a mechanism for implicature generation. So implicatures in general are supposed to come about when taking the speaker to be conveying the literal meaning of their sentence would require seeing them as flouting one or more of his general conversational maxims, or maybe just a cooperative maxim. And the hearer, in that case, is then licensed to infer an alternative proposition as the one that the speaker is implying. So we have this mechanism for recovery of the implicature based on a derivation using the maxim. And furthermore, he gives us 3 tests for implicature content. So again, I take it people are very familiar with these. First of his tests is non-detachability. If we keep the context and the content fixed, we have to get the implicature. You can't find another way of saying the same thing which in that context would lose the implicature. So as he says here, it's not possible, well, that's pretty much what I just said. If you keep the content fixed and the context doesn't change, you just have to get the implicature. So it's supposed to be calculable. This is basically the mechanism I just talked about. The supposition that S thinks that Q is required if the speaker is to be seen as abiding by the conversational maxims. The speaker hasn't stopped the hearer from thinking that Q, so the speaker has implicated that Q. They have to be calculable in this way. And finally, perhaps the most famous of his tests, the test of cancelability. If we keep the content fixed, but we shift the context, we might well lose the implication. So you can find lots of contexts where the reference writer case doesn't carry the implicature that Jones is no good at philosophy. Or we could change the content by calling back the implicature. We can add but not P, or oh, I don't mean to be implying that P. And in those cases, the form of words loses the implicature. So implicatures have to be cancelable. Okay, so can we just take those 3 tests for implicature and take it that we've got a well-defined notion that we know what implicatures really are? Well, there are some well-known problems with Grice's tests. So non-detachability doesn't hold for conventional implicature. So conventional implicatures, things like, the paradigm case, she's poor but honest. That's supposed to just literally mean she's poor and honest, but it conveys the implicature. But that's not detachable, right? You could find another way of expressing the same content, namely using and you're going to lose the implicature in question there. And it also doesn't hold for manner cases, which, as the name suggests, depend on the manner of expression of the content. Calculability, again, it doesn't hold for conventional implicatures. These aren't supposed to be things that we calculate on the basis of the maxims in the way that we do for other implicatures. And I won't really go into this point here, but we might worry about whether calculability is really sufficient because it isn't supposed to be a claim about online processing. It's a claim about what's rationally reconstructed, and we might think more things are potentially rationally reconstructible than we really want to count as implicatures. So there might be some movement between those 2. Cancelability, again, it doesn't hold for conventional implicatures. You can't pull them back. And we might question how robust our intuitions about cancelability are. Questions about, sometimes it's just not obvious whether someone really can withdraw a bit of content without contradiction in the way that Grice seems to be depending on. So what should we do about these problems? Well, it looks like one obvious way to fix up the test is just to stop talking about conventional implicatures, right? They seem to be the bugbear in all these kinds of cases. So maybe we should listen to Kent Bark and assume that there's no such thing as a conventional implicature. Maybe we could follow Chris Potts and think that we just have to say something really special about conventional implicatures. But even if we fix up the test in that way, I take it that the really big problem with Grice's tests is that they're just tests for pragmatic content in general rather than tests for indirectly conveyed implicature content. Okay, so this is the worry about explicatures that we've already talked about a little bit. But let's have a look at some of them. Comparative adjectives. Jill is tall for a jockey. Quantifier restriction, everyone came to the party, everyone in class 3 came to the party. Incomplete expressions, Steele is strong enough to support cars on the bridge. Logical and scalar terms, Bill got married and had children, heard as Bill got married and then had children. Some people came to my talk, meaning some and not all the people came to my talk. Could give me examples of metaphor, loose talk, a whole set of more cases. So all of these contents then, all the ones where there's a bit of content underlined, These are pragmatically derived contents. There's not supposed to be anything in the sentence, no word in the sentence that's calling these bits of content into the proposition expressed. They're coming from the conversational context, but they seem to be things that are directly conveyed, right? They don't have this flavor of implicatures. They don't have the flavor of being something indirectly communicated. You know, the person who says Jill is tall might just be heard as saying that Jill is tall for a jockey, where that's, you know, the content they want to be taken as directly asserting, not some kind of off-record or underhand implicature kind of case. So explicature content then, it's content that's directly conveyed, but which is pragmatic content. It contributes to Grice's notion of what is said or asserted. So it falls, if you remember the diagram of Grice's picture, it's supposed to fall on this side, the side that we thought of as kind of semantic, not on that side, the side that we thought of as pragmatic. So what should we do then? We've got these three tests, but they seem not to individuate a class of implicatures. They seem to individuate a class of pragmatically conveyed content. So what might we do? Well, we might go a limitivist, okay? We might decide that what this shows us is that we haven't really got a robust category of implicatures at all. And I take it that that's the kind of move that Lepore and Stone have been making in their 2014 book. So they deny that the category of implicature is one that has any theoretical value, because they think it doesn't pick out a unified kind of category. So their book, you know, the title is Imagination, Convention and Imagination, or Imagination Convention, Imagination Convention. So they think that there are these two kinds of processes that you engage in when you're doing interpretation of an utterance. One of them appeals to convention, and when it appeals to convention, it counts as semantic. It's this kind of tractable, systematic process that will get you to a determinate bit of content. And some implicatures, they think, are like that. So things like scalar cases, some of the people came to my talk, meaning some and not all, indirect requests, please, can you pass the salt, meaning pass the salt. These cases they think of as conventional, and they think they are semantic, therefore, and they get onto the conversational record for them. So they don't qualify as implicatures, they qualify as this, you know, convention-based semantic content. Whereas other things that we've counted as implicature really are recovered on the basis of imagination. So as they put it, they're imaginative, open-ended invitations to explore the conventionally given content. And that's supposed to be non-semantic, so that's stuff like metaphor and irony and sarcasm. All of that is going to fall under this imaginative exploration of content. So we then don't have a category of implicatures anymore, because we don't have this divide that Grice gave us between what is said and what is implicated, because implicatures are going to straddle the conventional, non-conventional divide. That is, they're going to straddle the semantic, non-semantic divide. So this idea that implicatures are this kind of further derivable content just drops out of the picture. Okay, but I think this limitivist model seems pretty unattractive. Firstly, everything that they count as an imaginative exploration of content is going to fall off the conversational record for them. It's only the conventional stuff that gets on there, and all the rest is this kind of, I don't know, fuzzy, pragmatic-y kind of stuff that we engage in. But I always thought that the conversational record was supposed to be the content that was going to help me decide what contribution I was going to make to the conversation, what kind of move I should make next. But implicature content and metaphor content, loose talk, all those kinds of things, they're directly relevant to me when I want to decide what I should say next. So if they really want metaphor, et cetera, to disappear from the conversational record, it looks like I'm going to have to run two conversational records. There's the neatly determinate conversational record that I get just via convention, and then there's a kind of enriched conversational record that gets metaphor and stuff like that onto it, and it's that second one that will determine my contribution to the conversation. But that seems, I don't know, that seems an unhelpful way of looking at things. It seems to be multiplying conversational records in a way that is unhelpful. Furthermore, the hallmark that they have for these kinds of imagination-based cases is that the content you arrive at is really fuzzy. You know, there's no determinate content. That's why they think, can you pass the salt? qualifies as conventional because there's a determinate content there. It means, can you pass the SALT? Or please pass the SALT. Whereas a metaphor case, there's no neat answer to which metaphorical content you're supposed to be arriving at. But I take it that that doesn't hold for every implicature type case. There are lots of kinds of cases we could give you where the content is just obvious. You know, there's nothing fuzzy about it. If you really spell out the context, the kind of content you're going to get as an implicature is really just as determinate as other kinds of content. And finally, I kind of worry about the bigger picture stuff. The notion of convention that they end up using looks like it's pretty ad hoc. And it's hard to see how you flesh it out in any way that draws the boundaries in the place that they want to. And this is the point that Rob Stainton's been making in a range of places recently, but mostly in that one. So if we don't want to be a limitivist, right, if we want to hang on to this idea that we really do have a category of contents that are indirectly conveyed by utterances that we make in context, what might we do? Well, we might think that what we need is the kind of three-way split that we saw in Alison's talk earlier between, so we replace this binary distinction between what is said and implicatures with a three-way distinction between the literally encoded meaning, the literal content, these explicatures, the kind of pragmatically conveyed content that's directly expressed, and these implicatures, the indirectly conveyed pragmatic content. So we could have had lots of people here making this kind of point. We could have had Sperber and Wilson, or Carsten, or Francois, but here's Soames doing it for a change. So Soames says, in all these cases, so thinking about explicature cases, meaning or semantic content is incomplete, with conversational maxims playing an important role in selecting contextual completions. In this way, the maxims contribute to what is asserted, and thereby to the truth conditions of utterances. These cases contrast with classical conversational implicatures, in which one says or asserts one thing, and as a consequence implicates something else that is not asserted. So this is arguing for this three-way distinction. We have explicatures which aren't indirectly conveyed in the way that implicatures were. Okay, so I think this three-way divide looks attractive, and indeed it's what I'm going to endorse in the end. But I think it requires a criterion of individuation, right? If we want to have two different kinds of content, explicatures and implicatures, we better have a way of telling for any given pragmatic enrichment of a linguistically encoded content, whether that counts as an explicature or whether that counts as an implicature. So what kind of criterion are we going to have? Well, I've argued elsewhere that there are basically three places, I think, that we could look for this kind of criterion. We could look to the formal features of the language. We could look to the psychological features of speakers and hearers. Or we could look to the sociolinguistic features, the role that given bits of content play in various kinds of linguistic exchanges. So the formal features are going to be things like the scope test, like Stanley's binding condition, like Sperber and Wilson's notion of a development of logical form. So it's going to be the idea that we have a way of individuating explicature content, the kinds of pragmatic alterations that are allowed on the basis of these formal features, like whether or not a bit of content gets under the scope of an operator or not. I'm just trying to think, so I'm not going to talk about the formal features because I think most of the people who like this three-way divide have decided that the formal features aren't really going to do the work required. As far as I know, most of the relevance theorists don't really like the scope test entirely anymore, but I don't know if there are any contextualists out here who do like the formal approach, then we can talk about it in discussion. I've got a slide on psychological features, but since Alison talked about them, I'm wondering whether I'll just say, do I want to talk about this? Okay, so I think the formal features aren't going to work. We can't look to the formal properties of our linguistic expressions to isolate these differences in content. But maybe we could look to the minds of speakers or hearers, okay? So maybe we could think that something is an explicature if it's the content that the speaker that we could think of something as an implicature if it's the content that the speaker intends indirectly to convey. It's something that they think they're getting, that they're going to get a hearer to get to kind of in an inferred or deductive kind of way. Or maybe we could appeal to the hearer, and we could think that something is an implicature if it's the content that the hearer derives from some first primary accessible content that they get when they hear an utterance. But as Alison touched on, I just don't think that if we look at what's going on in terms of psychological online processing, we've got any reason to think that we'll find contents like these that really match to the contextualist intuitions about what counts as explicature content. So this is the case that we just looked at a minute ago about the idea that sometimes you can just directly access an implicature content. So it's not going to be the case. So on the speaker intentions, I don't think speakers are likely to have intentions about what they want to directly convey or indirectly convey. I think they may well just have kind of vague ideas about what they're trying to get across and not be clear about whether this is a directly conveyed bit of content or something I'm going to indirectly convey. You're just trying to get your message across. And from the hearer's point of view, I think there are going to be lots of cases where you just go directly to the kind of content that somebody wants to count as an implicature. So it's not an account of the online processing of the hearer's understanding in the way that this condition seems to make it. And I just wanted to point out that that's something that Grice seems to agree with. Okay, so Grice suggests that there can be what he calls direct access implicatures. And he says that what's required by this mechanism so that implicatures can be intuitively grasped, he says. So it seems that the mechanism Grice gave us about inferring an implicature by seeing the literal content as flouting one of the maxims and using that as the basis to infer a further implicature, looks like that's supposed to be an account of rational reconstruction, not an account of online processing. So if we're just looking to the minds of current speakers and hearers, it doesn't look like we're going to find a principle that will hold them apart. Okay, so I'm going to skip mostly the problems that I think there are with those two other suggestions, and I'm going to move on to my positive proposal. And I think this will be echoing some of the things that Liz was saying in the first talk, so there's a nice kind of symmetry to this conference. I'm going to close by saying the same things that we said right at the beginning. So I think that there's a sociolinguistic dimension to language that we need to be really sensitive to. So maybe the distinction between an explicature and an implicature is something that arises because of the relationship between these social norms and cultural expectations and the contents that we're interested in. So what is said has been a really vexed notion in this literature. There's been lots of questions about what is meant by what is said, what kind of notion it is. And I think that we should understand the ordinary language, what is said, as a composite notion. Okay? It covers a range of different features and it can be used in a range of different ways. So we might mean by what is said acceptable judgments of reported speech. That might be what we're sensitive to when we're asking about what someone said. We might be asking about acceptable judgments of what gets onto the conversational record. What did someone say? What content is it okay to take them as being committed to on the conversational record? Or we might be interested when we ask about what is said about the kinds of linguistic liability that a speaker has for a given piece of content. And I think we need to distinguish two kinds of liability here. I think there's a strict notion of linguistic liability, where that's a kind of binary notion, either you are or you aren't responsible for a given bit of content. And then there's a more relaxed notion, which I'll call conversational linguistic liability, where that's a matter of degree, and someone might be taken to be more or less conversationally liable for some content. So when we're asking about what is said, and about whether what they said is an explicature or an implicature, I think we could be asking about all these different kinds of things. But notice if we're interested in these first two things, if we're interested in our judgments about reported speech, or our judgments of what gets to go on the conversational record, then I take it there's just no difference between what we think of as an explicature and what we think of as an implicature. Sometimes it's right to report a speaker as only having said the explicature content, but sometimes it's fine to be more relaxed. If someone asks me about the reference writer, what did Sarah say in her letter of reference, I can say, oh, she said that we shouldn't hire Jones. That seems an okay way to report, at least in some context, even though that's the implicature content. Or again, as we talked about a moment ago, if we're interested in what gets onto the conversational record, and we think of the conversational record as what's going to dictate the kinds of conversational moves that are open to me, then we have to allow that that has both explicature and implicature content on it. So the only place where we're going to find the grounds to distinguish between these kind of slight pragmatic enrichments that we want to count as explicatures and these richer contextual interpretations that we want to count as implicatures. The only place we're going to do it is by looking at this notion of how liable someone is for a given bit of content, how much we hold them responsible for it, what are the kinds of conditions of retraction that we would allow. So I want to suggest then that we do get the kind of three-way divide in meaning that we saw the contextualist as offering us earlier, and I would have something like this. I want to say that there's a notion of literal content, where the content that we arrive at, that I'll call P, involves no pragmatic modulation beyond the kind of stuff that Grice originally placed on his what is said by the sentence side, so disambiguation and reference determination. And I want to say that that kind of content is the content that you can't retract without contradiction, the stuff that you're really strictly held liable for in a given kind of context. But then we have this weaker notion of conversational liability, this graded notion. And I want to say that it's that graded notion that holds apart our notions of explicature versus implicature content. So something counts as an explicature content, I want to suggest, if it involves more pragmatic modulation or more pragmatic enrichment and alteration than the literal content did. And it's a content that normal hearers would treat a speaker as being strongly conversationally liable for. On the other hand, something counts as an implicature, I think, if its content, if it involves this kind of richer pragmatic modulation or enrichment, but it's a content that the speaker would be held less conversationally liable for, more weakly conversationally liable, easier to retract than these kinds of cases. Okay, so how are we doing for time? Am I doing for time? I'm not sure when I'm finishing now. No, that's okay. Oh my goodness, my hours. I'll slow right down. So look, for those who know this kind of debate between minimalism and contextualism and other forms of semantic theory around here, this kind of picture looks a lot like the contextualist picture, right? Because these two notions are the contextualist notion, the difference between explicature content and implicature. And all I've suggested is that the kinds of tests that I find in a lot of contextualists, which are to do with the formal properties, things like the scope test, or to do with psychological features like accessibility or primary recovery or something, those don't seem to do the work required, but maybe once we look to the sociolinguistic realm, we find a perfectly reasonable way of holding apart these notions. But if I want to still be a minimalist, right, and allow for this kind of distinction, I've got to claim that this stuff up here in 1 really is truth valuable, even though that might not be entirely the right way to characterize the debate here. It still seems like an important kind of distinction. So I'm just going to close then by trying to suggest why we really do need this three-way distinction, where the first thing up here really qualifies as propositional content rather than just some weaker skeletal linguistically encoded content. So actually, I think with Liz's talk, I think that was kind of the picture you were suggesting as well, that this is skeletal. So I'm going to suggest some reasons for hopefully thinking that it has to be more truth valuable than that. So I think that there's a range of activities, speech activities that we engage in, which really do reveal a kind of sensitivity to this minimal level of truth valuability, the idea that there's a content that you're committed to just by the words you produce in the structure that you do, and where that content is genuinely truth valuable. And I think one of the clearest cases it comes up in is thinking about the lying notion, the notion of lying. So take an utterance of Jack got married and had 2 children. And imagine here a thought experiment that Jenny Saul gives us, where you're talking to a rich Christian fundamentalist, okay? And the rich Christian fundamentalist is thinking of leaving Jack all of his money, but he only wants to do that if he thinks that Jack has lived his life according to the teachings of the Bible. So I know that Jack had his children out of wedlock. I don't want to let on about that because I like Jack and I want him to get the money, but I also, you know, I'm concerned about issues about how I inform people of information. So what I say is, oh, well, Jack got married and he had 2 children. Now imagine the rich Christian fundamentalist gives him his money, and then he goes away and finds out the facts about the temporal ordering here. It looks like the Christian fundamentalists can come back to me and clearly charge me with misleading him, right? But I think our intuitions are pretty strong here, although maybe this is an empirical question and we can test it, that I didn't actually lie. You know, if a rich Christian fundamentalist comes back to me and says, you know, what the hell were you talking about? I can say, I never literally said that he got married and then had his children. You know, that was something you decided to take away from my utterance. And so sure, it was misleading, but the greater kind of culpability that comes with lying is a charge that I can resist, it seems here. So I want to suggest that capturing our intuitions about paradigm cases of lying requires us to posit a kind of minimal content, and it requires us to see that content as truth evaluable. There's a further question here that maybe we could talk about in discussion about whether or not you can lie with an explicature. So I phrased this about paradigm cases, and I think that that's as strong as the claim that I want to make. I don't want to necessarily say that you can never lie with an explicature. There may be cases, but what I want to claim is that those cases are kind of outliers, and they're cases that we can have a debate about. And that alone, I think, shows us that, you know, what's required for the absolutely paradigm cases, for the, you know, test cases of something being a lie, really is this notion of minimal content. And then we can debate about whether that notion extends out to these other cases or whether we keep it more restricted. So lying, I think, is a good place to look to for evidence about the truth evaluability of these minimal propositions. Misleading is another nice case. So misleading is a special kind of speech act where the speaker exploits the literal truth, usually, or sometimes the literal falsehood, of the sentence they produce, paired with the falsehood of the proposition they expect to communicate via their utterance. So this is a kind of case that I run into with my kids all the time. They are really good at this kind of thing, which is what makes children so annoying. You know, if I ask them to turn the telly off, they say, okay, I'll turn the telly off. And then I go away and I come back 3 hours later and they're still watching it. I'm, you know, what are you doing? I told you, you said you'd turn the television off. And I'm like, yeah, but I didn't say when I'll turn the television off. Or another case I often like is, you know, if I say to one of my children, give some of that cake, or give some of that cake to your brother, you know, they will break off the tiniest little crumb and they'll hand that over. And, you know, and then when I say, you know, look, he's crying now, give him some more cake. What are you doing? I told you to give him some of it. It's like, I gave him some of it, you know. I'm not culpable here. Clearly, they're culpable for something, right? They're culpable for misleading, and they're culpable for exploiting the devices of language. But, you know, that's quite a clever thing. I'm quite impressed sometimes when they do that. They really seem to reveal that they're sensitive to this distinction between what they've literally committed themselves to just by the words and the structure and what everyone is going to take them as committed to. And I take it that that kind of sensitivity that you find with uncooperative speakers, again, reveals that, in fact, we are sensitive to this distinction between what we're strictly committed to, just by words and structure, and the kind of content that every other speaker or every other hearer is going to take us as being committed to. So you get to avoid the charge of lying and the kind of unmitigated culpability there, and you're open to this lesser charge as misleading, where part of the responsibility for the hearer coming to believe this falsehood lies with the hearer themselves, right? It was perfectly reasonable that I inferred, or I arrived at the richer proposition that the kid was going to turn off the telly soon, but, you know, it was also partly it was me that got me there, not just the speaker. So I want to say that capturing our intuitions about misleading, again, requires this sensitivity to a truth evaluable minimal content. I think we might look to some kinds of experimental evidence, again, to show that there's a good role for minimal content, where that is genuinely a truth evaluable content. So we know that children are much less likely than adults to draw things like scalar implicatures, or to strengthen conjunctions to move from and to and then, or whatever other kind of strengthening of and we might do, or to either or, and not both. And they do that even when they're acquiring a language where the enriched readings are the kind of default readings for the adult language. So even in a language where, you know, some conventionally and pretty standardly convey some and not all, still children will be late drawing that kind of enriched reading. And they'll be much less likely than an adult to do it. And so again, I think what we're seeing there is that children are sensitive to this idea of what they're actually strictly committed to by their words versus what they're more conventionally committed to by the conversational context. There's evidence that we know that adult responses to literal readings and scalars are uniform. People will get or not get a scalar interpretation depending on the kind of language that they speak, the kind of linguistic community they belong to. But children's responses to literal readings, although the literal reading response is uniform by 5 years. As long as a kid knows the words and the structure, they're going to get the meaning for the literal content by the time they're about 5. But they're not uniform, either inter or intra-personally for scalars until over 9 years of age. So that means if I take one scalar case and I give it to a range of children, all of the same age, some of the kids will get the enriched reading and some of them won't. And if I take just one kid and I give them a bunch of different scalars, they'll get some of them and they won't get other ones. So again, we get this kind of difference between the trajectory of acquisition of the literal content versus the trajectory of acquisition of the pragmatically enriched meaning. And just to note that the tests that are used here, or the tasks that are used to establish whether kids are getting these readings or not, are variants of the kind of Crane and Thornton truth value judgment task. So you ask the child, is this true in this kind of situation? And it looks like you can only answer that kind of question if you're operating with a notion of content that's capable of making those kind of truth evaluation judgments. Okay, so I'm getting to the end here. So what I want to suggest, 2 slides I think on the big picture thing then, is that we need varieties of meaning. I think we need a formal, computationally tractable notion of sentence meaning, and that sentence meaning relativized to a context of utterance, I should have put that in there, to account for the productivity and systematicity of our understanding of natural language. We need there to be something stable and continuous and predictable that we do to explain how we acquire and use language. And I think this kind of content has to be truth evaluable to accommodate things like the relevant speech act properties, distinctions between lying, misleading, rules of the game versus the spirit of the game, strict interpretations in the law, perjury, defamation, all these kinds of notions require a truth evaluable minimal content. But I do think that contextualists, and this is a change of mind I should say, I do think that contextualists were right really to distinguish between this notion of an explicature, a slightly pragmatically enriched content, and an implicature. But I think that distinction can only be properly understood as a sociolinguistic perfect distinction of degree. It's not a difference in kind, right? The difference between semantic content and pragmatic content, I want to tell you, is a difference in kind. But this distinction is just a difference of degree, and it's to do with how responsible we hold speakers for different kinds of content. And I think the message of that, the kind of take-home message I want to suggest with this paper, is that it's a mistake to try to map the assertion-implication distinction, the distinction between what's explicitly conveyed and what's implicitly conveyed. It's a mistake to map that onto the semantic-pragmatic divide. So if you remember Grice's model originally, there was the stuff in red over here and the stuff in black or purple or whatever it was over there. And I said, you know, this is directly conveyed, this is indirectly conveyed, and this is semantic and this is pragmatic. And I think that is a real error here, to conflate those 2 kinds of distinctions. We should hold apart what it is for something to be semantic content and what it is for something to be explicit or, explicit content. So here's a really big table to finish with. I want to suggest that there's a difference in kind between semantic content and pragmatic content. According to me, that's a processing distinction. This stuff up here is systematic and tractable and computational. It's the kind of thing that if we thought that there was a module responsible for language understanding that took us all the way to some kind of limited semantic content, it's the kind of thing that a module could deliver for us. And it's a distinction in kind between pragmatic content, because pragmatic content we get at by this kind of rich, characteristically human, abductive, reasoning to the best explanation kind of processing. We take a big picture view of the stuff we know, not just the stuff we know about the language. But then the distinction between assertion and implication then crosses this border. So they're orthogonal distinctions to one another, because sometimes we assert just the literal content of our utterances, but sometimes we assert the explicature content. Sometimes we really do directly convey these kinds of slightly pragmatically enriched content. We can genuinely assert stuff that we have strong conversational liability for, even though that's stuff that's arrived at by this kind of richer pragmatic interpretation. And then we do have this genuinely different category of implicatures, things that we just have much weaker conversational liability for, things that we can retract much more easily. Okay, so I won't do this slide, and I will just conclude. So I want to suggest that, well, that when we look to Grice's tests for implicature, we find that they're good tests, but they're tests for pragmatic content in general. They're not tests that are designed to hold apart these different notions of pragmatically conveyed content, the notions of what's directly conveyed from what's indirectly conveyed. So I want to allow that not all pragmatic content is implied content. Some of the pragmatic stuff is directly asserted. So to differentiate explicatures and implicatures, we need to look to the sociolinguistic realm. We need to look to the kinds of things we do with our language and the kinds of responsibilities and liabilities that come with the things we express. But once we do that, once we start asking about responsibility and culpability, we find, I think, a real role for these minimal literal propositions, because things like lying and misleading and perjury and defamation are all things which rely on this kind of really strict notion of content. So we should recognize that the semantic pragmatic and asserted implied distinctions simply cross-cut one another. Semantic pragmatics, at least according to me, is a type-level processing distinction, where the distinction between assertion and implication is a token-level sociolinguistic distinction. So contrary to Lepore and Stone, I think we should retain Grice's category of implicatures, but we should have it just as a speech act category, not as the thing that lies in kind of opposition to semantics.